inclined to believe in Bigfoot as an interdimensional being, which is an argument I've heard many times. And rather, I see both the rational and the irrational in the belief of Bigfoot. That once it's established that it does fit within somewhere of the natural world, it also, again, it jars us. It monkey wrenches us into remembering we can't be so rational about what we think we know up front, that there are still many mysteries to be explained. And that's what we'll get into coming up next. What about the monsters of Christopher Columbus? Christopher Columbus's monsters coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Well, to paraphrase the book Monsters in America, the outcast are monsters. Monsters are outcast. That's the band Outcast, anyway. And the history of America includes a history of monsters. What about Christopher Columbus's monsters? We'll get into that. Plus, our own American werewolves next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. All right, so Scott Poole is the professor behind Monsters in America. Let's talk about the monsters that plagued Christopher Columbus. What did he see both on the way over, and what were the monsters that he saw once he arrived in the New World?
Well, he at least went hunting for monsters and expected to see some. This is actually a side of Christopher Columbus that has not been explored very much, particularly by American historians. I mean, we know he went in search for trade routes. We know that he went in search for slaves. But he also actually made it very clear in his own journals that he was on the lookout for monsters. And as he spent time in the Bahamas, later in Hispaniola or Haiti, he recorded a number of stories in 1492 and 93, about stories about one-eyed men, men with dog heads, a race with dog heads that decapitated their victims and drank their blood. And this sort of rhetoric showed up so frequently in Columbus that, some scholars have now gone so far as to say, he's sort of obsessed with monsters, and that the voyage to the New World was in part a kind of a monster hunt. All of this is being informed by that background we were talking about earlier, the expectation of finding monstrous races in those places out beyond the map.
And the typical belief then, too, back in Europe, in a way, was that they were hearing about all these different monsters that were being reported back to them. Yet, part of the claim, and I love this about the book, is that we really start to explore what are unique American monsters, not ones that they had a frame of reference for necessarily in the Old World. But the Old World and the New World come together on a couple of those universal monsters of the 1930s, which I love. The fact that really Dracula is, although our version of Dracula is now the common accept. I mean, the Americanization of Dracula has now sort of overtaken and sort of stamped over the original. The original Dracula was was sort of strictly European.
Well, yes, and I mean, of course, vampire folklore is an Eastern European phenomenon going, at least back to the late medieval, early modern period. Although we do owe, as it's been said many times, we owe most of our vampire mythology to Bram Stoker's Dracula of the 1890s, and really even more so to popular culture. Vampires are very much American monsters in the sense that most of the attributes that we connect to them, and even kind of their cultural meanings, have really been born out of particular moments in American history.
Okay, but one of the things I want to point out is that the definition of monsters, I think the core understanding to me of monster is that it has to be a being, whichever type of being we're talking about, alien being, natural being, supernatural being, serial killer, whatever. Mm-hmm. But I think it has to be a being that we perceive as being without a soul. The soul here, I know it can take on a couple of different definitions, and it can mean the divine spark, but I think at its core, it really just means self-awareness. And when a monster to me is something that lacks self-awareness of the effects that it's having on others, or the impact, or whether others even exist, or that we all exist for that monster's pleasure. That to me is the core. That's when we use the word monster, I think, most effectively, when we're talking about whether it's a serial killer, or whether it's a corporate executive in a way, and I'm just using that as an example, somebody who literally just has we saw that report came out a couple of years ago that said 1 out of 10 corporate executives on Wall Street qualify as having a pathological problem, that whereas 1 out of 100 in the United States might be considered so narcissistic or psychotic, but on Wall Street the number is actually higher, and you have to be in a way to only think in terms of numbers and making money and not caring about the people that it impacts. And I just think that's where to me that definition of monster, whether it's the early monsters that the Puritans were seeing, or whether it's the universal monsters or the monsters we look at in the news, it's those beings without a soul. Your thought on that?
Well, I think that works for some monsters and not for others. So,
give me an example of that doesn't work for you. Yeah.
So for example, we do have our sympathetic monsters. Frankenstein's monster over time has become a sympathetic monster, almost a kind of an image of humanity in certain kinds of ways. And then, in the 40s and 50s, when you have the beginning of the contactee movement, the sort of explosion of interest in flying saucers, I mean, very frequently, although they certainly were sort of these creatures, these vehicles of the uncanny, which is one way you could think about the monster, they were frequently friendly. Sort of this idea of the messianic alien, the space brother notion that became very common among contactee groups in the 50s and 60s. That was a really important part of their ideal, and then in pop culture. Well, but wait,
I want to step in there, and I think that makes my point, though, is that before they were perceived as having a soul, they were monsters. When they became humanized, if you'll pardon the term, when they became like us, when they became less of the other, when they were no longer malevolent but benevolent and here to help us and to guide us, they're no longer thought of as monsters. So they were monstrous when they didn't have a soul.
Well, I think, though, that we often, particularly in pop culture, tell redemptive tales of monsters.
Okay.
We tell the story of the vampire with a soul. Thinking about Angel from Buffy, for example. We tell stories about monsters that are vehicles of transcendence in different ways. I don't know if they cease to be other. I think that part of those stories is testing our own boundaries about how and where we will build community. I've already alluded to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, so I'll say more about that. I mean, in a way, the trajectory of that show came to be questioning whether or not it was possible to form a community with the other. And I think that the answer to that was yes. You can do that while the other still remains other. Now, I think that's a somewhat recent development in the history of the monster, but still something that's very important.
Well, I think in a way it's our way of owning monsters. It's getting over our fear of monsters. But I'm all right. I'm gonna stick to my guns here a little bit on that definition, and I'm going to say that while it's true, monsters can be reformed and therefore no longer become monsters. And I think when you have a friendly vampire, it's no longer a monster. So, I mean, that's true. I think the true notion of that which are monsters are people that we think of as like Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. I think that actually is the best example of that. It didn't have a soul because it wasn't it didn't have it had only a human origin. You know, it was put together out of, it was reanimated out of dead material. And I give you another example of that, and I know you touch on it in the book. I went to see Silent House today, and I love,
I love it yet, but I'm interested to see it.
Right, and I love movies that play on that idea of the inanimate, the threatening inanimate, where it's some sort of a house, a car, or whatever that is the malevolent force. And I think that speaks to the idea of the monstrous. It doesn't have a soul. Mm-hmm. It's a house. And so in a way you can't reason with it. You can't bargain with it. You can't, right. It doesn't care about you. It doesn't, you're not wood. You're not also a house. It doesn't, you know, it's there to swallow.
Well, and I think that's part of the reason why so many of our stories about monsters are really stories that we're telling about the nature of evil, and evil imagined as chaos that is uncontrollable. A sort of a representation of those parts of human experience that are essentially unexplainable. And it is interesting that, you know, we were talking about the soul. I mean, sort of the Christian concept of the soul, which I think sometimes is part of monstrous mythology and sometimes really isn't. They come from a lot of different sources. I mean, I think it's no accident that we end up talking about the vampire when talking about souls and monsters, because the vampire, of course, is a very Christian monster in some ways. I mean, it's sort of impossible to imagine that mythology with the crosses and connection to resurrection and all of that without the Christian framework. On the other hand, I mean, going back to some of our discussions about the 50s, I mean, you know, so many of the monsters of the 50s were monsters of science, were the products of atomic weapons and radioactivity and all the other kinds of real-world things that people had very good reason to be afraid of, you know, during that period. This goes a little bit beyond even my own topic, but you know, one of the things that interests me very much is the idea that you find, particularly in Buddhism, of the monster as a vehicle of transcendence, as in fact a kind of a guide to enlightenment. There's this whole tradition in Japan of these terrifying monsters who become temple guardians because they convert to Buddhism. They are enlightened monsters, and they don't cease to be monsters. They don't become angels. They in fact are just as ferocious and just as terrifying, except now they are these guides to wisdom. And I think that's an idea that maybe is quite literally sort of foreign to much of our thinking about the monster, but maybe shouldn't be. Maybe something that we should ponder a bit more.
You know, and I'm grateful for that point. It's a very interesting one. I want to challenge you a little bit, and I think it's really a Judeo-Christian concept of the soul. It isn't purely Christian, and I think that also it transfers into other monotheistic religions as well, for example, in Islam. And the idea of human beings as being different from other animals because we have a soul, you know, that covers a wide area. When it comes to Dracula and the treatment that it got from the Universal, and from Bram Stoker and from the later the Universal movie version, is that I think it's actually it's a blend of pagan tradition and Christian tradition. It becomes a very earthy Christianity in a way, to think that you could use garlic or you could use a crucifix, that garlic and a crucifix were equal. And I think what also is interesting, it goes from a crucifix, which is an image of Christ on the cross, to just a cross, or even just holding your fingers up. And I think that, again, it comes down to, I think it shows this evolution of this belief that we're always trying to come up with an antidote. And we'll take any antidote, whether it's bulbs that we're pulling out of the ground or something that we're pulling down off the wall of our house, like a crucifix. But we're on to the subject of Wolfman, which
Sounds good. I love werewolves. I keep hoping werewolves will make a comeback.
I think they are. I think they do.
Yeah, I don't know.
You see, are they your favorite monster?
They're not my favorite. They're probably my favorite category of monster.
Okay.
My favorite monster is probably the Bride of Frankenstein. I just love that whole narrative. But werewolves, yeah. I mean, I keep hoping that they'll become the new zombie.
Right. Well, and that's the other discussion of zombies. In fact, I was looking at some of my Twitter comments, and people are asking about zombies and the idea of the infected dead. What do you think that's all about?
Well, we think about the popularity of the zombie as being a fairly recent phenomenon. I mean, sort of the last decade with books like World War Z and that kind of stuff. But it's actually part kind of this longer trajectory. I mean, as many of your listeners know, I mean, kind of the first modern zombie movie was Night of the Living Dead in 1968, and that was quite popular on the drive-in and the grindhouse circuit, and kind of grew in popularity over the years. So zombies have been with us for a little over 40 years, and I think have kind of been growing in popularity during that whole time. I think it's really interesting that this really coincides with a time period in which Americans, for some very specific historical reasons, some very specific cultural reasons, become deeply, deeply obsessed with the body. And when you have a growing fear of infection, contagion, viral outbreaks of one kind or another. So, for example, actually both the zombie and the vampire, I think, benefited, I talk about this in the book, benefited from the plastic surgery revolution of the 1980s, which in turn coincided with kind of the explosion of dieting culture. You think about the zombie, I mean, it's sort of the ultimate nightmare of American culture's fascination with bodily fulfillment. Here's this monster that is us, but is a rotting, decaying version of us that is hungry all the time. That is literally an eating machine. And so they are. The thing that I guess really fascinates me the most about the zombie is the way in which they are just very embodied monsters. All of the horror connected to them is really horror of the body and horror related to the body.
Nathan, are we a little early for the bottom of the hour break? I think we are, aren't we? I mean, I'm enjoying hearing the Munsters theme, but you're kind of freaking me out there. If you don't mind. That kind of scared me, as though the monsters are right behind me. I think you're about a minute or two early. But that just gives me a chance to go back to the Wolfman and to werewolves in general. Sure. I'm very interested in that, and I'm interested not just because there are cases of people who have taken a position in the wild. We know of, we would call them madmen today, or serial killers. I think our modern serial killers, Richard Ramirez, or some of the other people that stalked the hills looking for victims, I think they would have been thought of as shapeshifters.
Yeah.
They would have been thought of as werewolves, that they would have had the ability to come in and come out of society.
Right.
That was the way that they would have been thought of 100 years ago. And today we don't see them that way, but they're still monsters. I mean, serial killers are still monsters.
Sure. And in fact, if there was sort of a golden age of the werewolf, it was probably France in about the 16th century, when there were actually werewolf trials. I mean, that was actually kind of the form that witch hunting took in France during that period. And at least one explanation that has been given for that is essentially the phenomenon of serial murder, which there was not really a cultural narrative to explain in the way that we have it today. So I think that's a very valid sort of comparison. I think also the fascination with the serial killer may be very much like our fascination with the werewolf. I mean, werewolves are tapping into this very primal, very violent part of ourselves, and I think that's part of the reason we love them.
All right, so let's pick up with a conversation about Frankenstein and weird science. Okay,
great.
From Monsters in America, and I was reading this guy named Daniel, who's a big defender of science at Deacon Punnett. I'm sure he'll be freaking out about this coming up, but not everything science does makes perfect sense, and science has had its voodoo moments over the years, and in fact, some horrible things have been done in the name of science, and we'll talk about that in context of Monsters in America, our historical obsession with the hideous and the haunting. So, look forward to continuing the conversation with you until next month, by the way, at Deacon Punnett on Twitter. And hang on, because we haven't even got to your phone calls yet before the end of this show with Dr. Scott Poole, expert on monsters in our culture. On Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. Well, we all have our Wolfmans, you know. Dr. Scott Poole, Monsters in America. We'll talk more about weird science, the monstrous in science, next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. As a historian as well as a author, Scott Poole is a pop culturalist, and it's no surprise that the book begins with discussions of movies. And throughout the entire book, you address the monsters in our pop culture. I don't think I've ever seen the original version of Frankenstein that you referenced, though. I mean, I've seen Frankenstein a half a dozen times. I don't think I've ever seen the line where Dr. Frankenstein yells, as you quote here in Monsters in America, "Now I know what it feels like to be God." That was in the original print, and it was edited out?
That was edited out. It was actually edited out by a crash of thunder. But in the original version, and I have seen a print that you hear this pretty clearly, that does appear there. And of course that really sort of captured the spirit of Shelley's original narrative.
Sure.
But there was a lot of concern. I mean, this is early days of horror film. And so there's a lot of concern about touching on those themes. So much so that, as you might remember from the version that you have seen of Frankenstein, it actually begins with Carl Laemmle coming out and essentially saying, "Hey, this is a moral parable. This is about sort of reminding us that we shouldn't have hubris in relation to life and to God and et cetera." So yeah, I mean, some of the really strong medicine that's in that film about these kind of more Promethean themes just don't quite make it. You see that in the Bride of Frankenstein as well, where Elsa Lanchester at the very beginning plays Mary Shelley, and essentially says the same thing, that she's trying to tell a moral tale.
That's true for the beginning of Thriller. Remember the Michael Jackson video, which was originally released to MTV, and then because of pushback from his family about their belief, their Jehovah's Witness beliefs, he established a similar, screen, a producer card at the beginning of the video, which had to be shown every time, which said this is not about real beliefs. This is But it's so fascinating that somebody like Michael Jackson, who supposedly didn't believe in all these things, was upside down in them and thought about them constantly and loved them. And so often is it's the obsession of those people who say that they don't exist, but they can't stop thinking about it.
Right. But, yeah, and I think it also points to the fact that the story of horror, I mean, horror narratives in general are about things that we suppress and also things that we decide that we want to see. And so there's always sort of this issue of what's being shown and what isn't being shown. And I think that actually goes to the larger issue of the way that horror gives access to ourselves, but also to our history and to our culture that maybe we can't find any other way.
But let's talk about science then in general in context of Monsters in America, because there are real sad examples of science messing with people's lives, doing experiments on living creatures, and in fact, human beings in a way which one hates to use such strong language. The Nazi comparison is overplayed, but at the same time, for all of the horror things that Dr. Mengele was doing on innocent children or humans for that matter, in Nazi concentration camps, later on, scientists in America, in respectable hospitals and universities, were doing these experiments on unwitting victims there as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's really no comparison in terms of scale, but you're certainly correct that, and to some degree in terms of motivation, but you're certainly correct that some of what we know, or what we sometimes have chosen not to know about the history of medicine, the history of science, particularly in relation to constructions of race, is pretty terrifying, and as I say in the book, is really connected to monster narratives of one kind or another.
But so we're talking about, established medical universities, medical schools rather, at major universities that were injecting children or retarded children with radioactivity, giving them radioactive food,
right,
just to study them and just stuff like that. And so that becomes part of it, reflects both the reality of monsters in America, but also our fascination with being transformed by radiation.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, and that was true of, of course, that was going on in the late 40s, early 50s. I talk about how, the Frankenstein metaphor and the Frankenstein narrative is so popular in America right at a time when there are essentially these racist discourses circulating in science. This whole discussion about the inferiority of African American people, particularly African American men, and ideas about criminality that are about and abroad, and that some very serious heavy hitters in the medical profession are taking very seriously.
Yeah, and that's kind of the weird part. And these were well-funded studies that were proving these crackpot, or attempting to prove these crackpot theories.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, there's what historians have long referred to as a scientific racism, quote unquote, in the late 19th century that did things like compared craniums and discussed this idea of higher races versus inferior races, with not surprisingly the conclusion that the white Anglo-Saxon race was superior. This is also the same time period as the popularity of the freak show, and so there's kind of this popular version of this, the sideshow element, which often presented the notion of people who had been born abnormally, often because they were represented as being exotic, foreign, or some sort of hybrid. And of course, the logic of white supremacy was that hybridity was always wrong. The old term miscegenation. That's sort of that's going to be the downfall of Western white civilization. And so, all these discussions are kind of going on at the same time, and then some of the real world effects of it are things like, in the 1930s, the Tuskegee experiments, the lynching epidemic between 1880 and the 1940s that took the lives of about 5,000 African American men. So,
and the rise of Hitler in Europe too. I mean, the same theories.
The discussion of eugenics in the 20s and 30s as well. I mean, and so what I really see is all these ideas really circulating at once, influencing one another, and so then it's really no accident that in James Whale's 1931 Frankenstein, you have this whole discussion of, well, the monster is a monster because it was implanted with a criminal brain.
Right.
There's this idea that criminality is genetic or what they would see as biological, simply biological, and that idea in a lot of the medical journals in the early 20th century tended to be racialized.
And yet, at the beginning of the rise of Hitler, too, just to pull that out a little bit, in America, for many people, he was not considered a monster. He was considered, therefore, kind of a hero. He represented a lot of these crazy theories and eugenics and these other things. And they thought of him as being sort of the embodiment of all that is the future. And he got a lot of support from some pretty high levels, both in our government and within, within industry. He got funded. He got Lindbergh in his back pocket. He had all these people that were for him. And we didn't understand that with the monster that he truly was, perhaps. Many people saw the monster at the beginning, but not everybody did until after the war. And that's an interesting, also kind of a transformation about what we think we know versus what it turns out to be. And I think that's part of our part of the monster story always, is that we think of something up front as being maybe better than it is, and then we find out how horrible it really was all along. It's kind of the monster secret in a way. And it goes to a lot of with serial killers the same way, with Ted Bundy, so many people saw him as just being this great Kennedy-like figure who was, going to be a future politician, and what a great guy. And his secret life was just absolutely monstrous.
Right, and I actually think that this is one place where monster stories and horror narratives can really serve us, because often these are very subversive kinds of stories that suggest that what we think is safe, what we think is secure, really is not, and force us even in of course, horror films are often very, very controversial because they're considered, too violent, too misogynistic, too just simply disturbing all the way around. And yet, they can become a way to sort of shake us out of our false senses of security, particularly our beliefs in things like American exceptionalism, our beliefs in things like the security of the suburbs. We know that they're never really secure in the horror film, that there's some sort of evil kind of eating at the heart of them. And also, they tend to call into question our representation of the other. Going back to our earlier discussion tonight about the sympathetic monster, and the idea of the possibility that the monster can show us certain parts of ourselves that maybe we don't like, but that's there.
Well, you mentioned the problem with the suburbs in monster lore. Where do the zombies always go to but the mall?
Sure, they go to the mall.
It's the buffet.
And, Michael Myers in Halloween. I mean, the night he came home, he came home to the suburbs. I mean, he came home to the place that. It's very interesting that film comes out in 1977. I mean, this is kind of the end of the era of close to the end of the era of white flight and kind of the new suburbanization of America, and people thought that these were safe havens where they could sort of live the 1950s all over again. And yet, that's sort of the subversive element in John Carpenter's work. He's sort of saying, no such luck. You not only are you still going to be the victims of evil, it's an evil that was actually raised in your midst.
And we found that we weren't safe in the shower in Psycho.
Right.
We weren't safe in the water in Jaws, and we weren't safe in our own homes in perfect suburbia in crime-free land.
And babysitters are always in danger too.
Right.
I mean, so yeah, I think that's something that horror can do, is it can subvert our expectations by these often kind of extreme stories of excess.
Let's, in the time we have, and then we'll take some calls coming up in just a few minutes about monsters in America, but sex comes into this somewhere.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, a history of American sexuality is a big part of the story of the monster.
And how does that change monsters?
I don't know that it changes monsters. I actually think, in a sense, that's always been part of the story of the monster. Where I begin that discussion is with a discussion of the Salem witch trials and the role that sexuality played in that, the construction of women who were witches as also women who could not control their bodies. literally, who had made not just pacts with the devil, but had formed sexual relationships with demonic beings. I think that part of the reason this is always part of the story of the monster is that monsters tend to be, in part, these kind of transforming, these sort of morphing versions of our own bodies. And so I think it's really no surprise that sexuality would almost always be a part of monster narratives.
Yeah, I thought you made an interesting point about the difference of after sort of the post-Kinsey report and post the sexual revolution, the time of the pill, and how that changes a little bit of the sexuality of our perception of monsters.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things that's happening in the midst of the sexual revolution is that many of the contactees in the contactee movement are claiming that not only are they seeing aliens, being visited by aliens, I mean, essentially they're saying, I'm having sex with aliens, either consensual or otherwise. And that also obviously becomes an important theme in after the 1970s and the story of the vampire. I mean, the Anne Rice. I mean, the vampire was already sexualized with Bela Lugosi, but
sure.
Anne Rice, the hugely popular Anne Rice novels, brought a new element to that. And I think that you see even today. I mean, with the popularity of shows like True Blood. I mean, that's a show that really sort of tests our boundaries and, represents all sorts of, polymorphous versions of sexuality. I mean, kind of everything imaginable. And so the monster, becomes an arena a fantasy arena where some of these things can be discussed and worked out.
Well, yeah, you don't have to actually go to one of these monster conventions where I've been, but I mean, you don't have to go there to imagine the amount of cleavage on display.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, and some of that is, and I'm not, I tend to not like to psychoanalyze my monsters or to turn them into psychological phenomenon, but, it is kind of a paging Dr. Freud moment when you think about, the connections that he drew between Eros and Thanatos. I mean, sex and death, and so that's at least one element of it. Although I don't think it's all of it. I think that maybe the more important part is that it becomes these kind of fantasy constructions where we can work out our issues as society changes. And monster stories have been both, stories of the sexual revolution and of the sexual counter-revolution in some ways.
Well, I think it's both.
Very conservative stories.
Well, I think there's that. I think there are elements of both in, say, even to go back to the Halloween story or to the classic, Scream movie narrative, that there's, it's the couple having sex that is the first ones that are the victims of the monster, or they're the ones that go off to go make out. So there's an
element of that, to be sure.
I think there's a moralistic tone to that, even while they manage to get the girl's shirt off for the shot of the movie.
Right, just in time.
Yeah, they get the shirt off, and then the punishment comes. But first, there's the payoff, and then there's the knockoff. So, right now, coming up in the next hour. Can I do this? I know there's a lot of interest in monsters in our pop culture, and I know that that's an interest of yours as well. And whether it's purely in Monsters in America, the book that you can link up to at coasttocoastam.com and find out more about there. Would you be interested, Scott, in taking some calls from people in discussing what their favorite monster is?
Oh, absolutely.
And what you see in those monsters. What is it? How is it that you find what's informative about that monster choice? You good with that?
Let's do that.
Okay. Well, so we have an hour. I'm really looking forward to this. We'll give you all the numbers that you need coming up after the top of the hour, and we'll go there. We didn't touch on some of the other chapters. Undead Americans, very interesting. And then Worse Things Waiting, which comes up toward the end of Monsters in America. An interesting conversation about our monsters and why they are unique to America, why we need them too, at the same time, how that brings us together as a people. And then I also look forward to, we're going to have a big show coming up on Easter Sunday. I'll tell you more about that coming up after the top of the hour. But I'm pretty sure it's already been settled, so I feel good enough about telling you what's coming up in April in just a few minutes. That'll be the next time I'm on Coast to Coast. And or in the meantime, contact me through Twitter. Look forward to staying in touch there at Deacon Punnett. Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. History shows again and again how nature points up the folly of man. Godzilla. We hadn't talked about Godzilla much. And there is, of course, the American Godzilla version, too, not just the Japanese, which would also fit nicely. In Monsters in America, our historical obsession with the hideous and the haunting. Dr. W. Scott Poole will take your calls coming up. And when we do, too, we'll us address your favorite monster. If there's a favorite monster you want to talk about, and what your favorite American monster. We'll limit it to that. We'd love to have you join the conversation coming up here on Coast to Coast. Now, I just want to say, just before the top of the hour, you heard Frankenstein. We played that from the Edgar Winter Group, and we just played it as kind of like a bumper into the top of the hour. But there was in the news, there was a death pertaining to Frankenstein. Not the original, of course, movie version or that, but the song by the Edgar Winter Group. There were, some Rick Derringer is most commonly associated with Frankenstein, and he was one of the most notable members of the group. But there were others, and there was one in particular who just died, and I want to tell you about that coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Well, all the lines are taken right now. We'll try and get you one in just a second. Going back a little bit to say Ronnie Montrose was a hard rock guitarist, known for being a solo artist or leading his own band, but he was one of the contributors to the Edgar Winter Group. And he died this week at age 64. Kind of a sad story at the end, as I understand it. But he'll live on in his contributions to great rock songs like Frankenstein, which we played just before the top of the hour. And that's what I also promised you a look ahead. And that's coming up on Easter. I don't know if it's confirmed yet, but we're looking forward to, at some point, if not Easter, right around that time, a new book out by theologian Bart Ehrman. You know him as a frequent guest here on Coast to Coast, and he has a new book out that is attempts to prove the existence of Jesus outside of the world of faith. It's an argument called "Did Jesus Exist?" And this is his amazing attempt at proving to people who believed that there was no real Jesus that there was in fact a historical argument that can be made for the existence of Jesus beyond the argument of faith. And that'll be coming up, I think. I don't want to jinx it, but I think on Easter next time I'm on. Let's go and grab a bunch of calls. We've got everybody standing by for Dr. Scott Poole, Monsters in America. Let's pick it up with Cora, who's in New Mexico on Coast to Coast. Cora?
Yes, I was wondering if you would consider the fact that the more a society is either repressed or oppressed is a factor in how bad the demons are and their reaction to them. And even in the case of body image and zombies, isn't that our pushback on Madison Avenue, expecting us to appear in the image they want us to present?
Scott?
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much a pushback as it is kind of a way to reflect on what that means. Zombies, as we were talking about earlier, they are these rotting versions of ourselves, and I think that that's as much a reflection on our own mortality as a response to, rather than simply a response to corporate structures and advertising and that kind of thing. In terms of the relationship between monsters and sort of repressed natures of fear in society, I think that monsters have been frequently a way to kind of let the tiger out of the cage, to kind of explore some of those repressed areas of ourselves. And certainly if you look at the history of the horror film in America, there's been all of these moments when the horror movie was sort of the one place there could be kind of an open airing of some of these issues. I think actually Frankenstein is a good example, because James Whale's version, taking place at a time when there was all this discussion about criminality, the popularity of the freak shows, all that sort of stuff, it was an opportunity to kind of pull back from that and say, well, wait a minute. Is the monster partially sympathetic? In what ways is the monster like us? What does it mean that we're so quick to become angry villagers and to sort of go out and hunt the monster? So I don't think it's a simple sort of hydraulic model in the sense of, the more we sort of repress, the more the monsters come out.
Well, I was just wondering, in the case of the Pilgrims, that was certainly a repressed society, and they were facing the extra danger of living in an unknown land, not knowing if they were going to survive like the winter. And that was a way of their not facing up to their repression and the effect of, mortality, basically.
I think it's a good point.
I mean, you're absolutely right that, the Puritans found themselves or thought that they were sort of surrounded by threats on every side. I think it's also interesting with them that so many of their threats came from within in their perspective. I mean, their fear of witches and also Quakers actually was kind of this fear of this kind of fifth column from within. Though it is really important to keep in mind that, it was not a simple fear reaction. They had a whole theological structure that went along with that and that they had brought with them, and that was part of the reason why they read their world in that way.
I saw Roger Brown sent me a tweet on this. Thank you, at Deacon Punnett. He said, horror movies have the monster attack couples who are making out, he said, because this represents the jealousy of the outcast. That's also a fair point, I have to say. All right, let's go to Max in Toluca Lake, California, on Coast to Coast for Scott Poole, Monsters in America. Max?
Hey, how's it going, guys?
Good, how about you?
Hey, Max.
I'm doing pretty good. I heard you make a comment earlier that you believe that Big Feet or Bigfoot or Sasquatch were actually not transdimensional or pan-dimensional beings.
I've heard the argument that they are interdimensional or pan-dimensional beings. I just find that less convincing than them having an actual corporeal existence.
Well, yeah, it's easy to say that without seeing it, but I've actually seen... when I was 7.5, I saw one materialize in front of me.
I can't dispute what you saw. I understand that.
Yeah, it appeared to me, I guess, kind of like a shadow person, I guess. It kind of just, it was stalking the woods. It was in the middle of the night. I was at a day camp, and we had a sleepover. I was with a couple of friends that were away from the rest of the kids and whatnot at night. Of course, we weren't
sure.
That.
Okay.
The other side
I trust your account. I mean, I'm not disputing that that's what you saw. It's in terms of it of fitting into a worldview. I won't take anything away from what you experienced, and I think that I hope that's something that you maintain to your death. But I just for me, I'm just not sure in the end that's how that's going to play out. Whether that is something else you saw that then you also attribute to being Bigfoot, I'm okay with that too. I just couldn't tell you for sure. I just can only tell you how I think of it. Let me get to Jean, who's in. Let me get to Allison. Okay, because she wants to talk about her favorite monster in America. Hey, Allison.
I don't think you've mentioned him yet, but the creature from the Black Lagoon.
Oh, I was hoping somebody would bring him up.
I just love him.
That's actually one of my favorites, too. And, of course, he was sort of late in the Universal Studios cycle. He's actually a creature of the 50s and is sort of a lot more like the creature features in that way. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it goes back to, I think, to our earlier discussion about monsters and sexuality, because there's sort of this King Kong theme with the creature from the Black Lagoon. He becomes very attached.
I know. Yeah, with Julie Adams, the actress.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And except it's more believable in a way because they're about the same size and everything too.
Right. And so. And so, I think that's one of the things that's very interesting about that, even thinking about sort of the otherness of the creature. I mean, he's this walking fish, right? and this is a very beautiful sort of ideal version of post World War II American womanhood. I mean that really, it really touched on notions of sexual threat and kind of the idea of the sort of white women in danger theme, which is something that I talk about in the book as kind of a sub-theme running through American history. And yet at the same time, he's sort of threatening and predatory, and yet he's a deeply sympathetic monster, in many ways more sympathetic than Frankenstein. Almost kind of embodies endangered nature in certain kinds of ways. He just wanted to be left alone in his lagoon, right?
Yeah, what I like about the movie poster always shows the creature from the Black Lagoon holding the actress. What did you say her name was? Julia Adams. And always holding her and always looking like he's just about to cop a feel. The hand is coming up right around.
Actually, with horror film posters in the 1950s was a pretty common theme.
Yeah.
Some of the more famous ones, like the Michael Landon, I Was a Teenage Werewolf, it definitely has sort of the werewolf as sexual threat. Even some of the alien invasion.
Well, it's just even in the poster, just to see the hand going for second base on the poster for the Black Lagoon, it couldn't get more obvious than that. Gene, west of the Rockies in Phoenix on Coast to Coast for Dr. Scott Poole. Go ahead, Gene.
Good evening. Hey, first of all, I'm a registered nurse. I married into the tribe, Navajo tribe, probably about 30 years ago. I lived up on the reservation. I recently have been, I've seen them before myself, but recently there's been an increase in the sightings up there, not only by the Navajo police, but one supposedly got hit on I-40 about 2 months ago by a semi, and they couldn't find the body afterwards. But what I'm talking about is skinwalkers. Now, I know how to be. I've had medicine men tell me, in the family, how to become one, and I've actually seen them firsthand out there in the woods at night. But, Doctor, this is something real. And it's just not just the skinwalkers up there. Of course, all the lights and activity that's been going up there is just going nuts. But this is documented by the Navajo police. They, out in Crown Point, they just did a series on what happened, and one got hit on I-40. They couldn't find the body. A semi hit it.
Right. So let's talk about that in terms of monsters in America, though, Gene.
Right.
So, go ahead. You got a point you wanted to make or a question?
Well, no, I have a question. What does the doctor, what do you think about, actual real monsters? This is something that's been documented.
Okay.
Seen, the Navajo referred to as Chingy. What do you think?
Again, I would go back to our earlier discussion. I don't think until there is empirical evidence for something, and eyewitness accounts, unfortunately, don't count as empirical evidence. I tend to be more interested in how those kinds of beliefs have functioned and why it is that they're important to people. I think the skinwalker belief is especially interesting because not only does it connect back to some of the important traditions of the Navajo, but it also has become kind of entangled in modern American urban legend. The old Route 666, which actually I believe in Utah the name has been changed, but it was a very common place to cite these sort of werewolf-like creatures, and so, I think that they kind of have performed this function of suggesting that there's still something wild out there, that the American frontier is not as closed as we think it is, or maybe as on some level that we really know that it is. But I just have to say I'm just not really interested in the question of sort of the reality, the kind of empirical ontological reality that your question suggests. I'm really interested in sort of what those stories mean. And obviously this is a story that means a lot to you and to a lot of people.
Let me go to Paul, who's in the Bronx on Coast to Coast for Dr. Scott Poole. Go ahead, Paul.
Yes, how you doing? How you doing, Ian? Hello to your guests also. Listen, I want to talk about America's fascination with mechanical monsters.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Hasn't come up yet. Good.
Yeah, that's great, because actually Ian mentioned the worst things waiting chapter in the book, and part of what I do there is I talk about our increasing fears of post-human monsters. Really sort of the idea of cybernetic monsters, which kind of began with sort of the killer android idea, and now I think has morphed into, in a way, sort of scarier places.
So what are you thinking of, Paul?
Yeah, I'm thinking about specifically monster trucks. I went to a monster truck show about 2 weeks ago in New Jersey, and it was fascinating because they had two specific. Well, first of all, they had the Superstar, which was Gravedigger.
Yeah.
But they had two trucks that fascinated me. One was a monster school truck. I mean, a monster school bus. And the other one looked like a giant lobster by the name of Crustacean.
Okay, well, that sounds interesting. But at the same time, it seems a little off topic. But thanks, Paul. Let me get to John, who's also in the Bronx and is obviously your neighbor. John, you have a quick thought on monsters in America?
Well, I wanted to ask your guest about the relationship between Ed Wood and Bela Lugosi, and mainly how did Bela Lugosi's real-life heroin addiction affect his depiction of Dracula and, his roles in other films?
Well, I don't know if that's in your wheelhouse, Scott, but I am curious about drugs and monsters in America.
Well, I can actually talk just a little bit about Bela Lugosi, not a lot, but I will say, actually, sort of the worst period of his heroin addiction was post-Dracula. And so it's actually a lot of the really terrible films that he was making in the 1940s after he left Universal, that you really saw the effects of that. Lugosi is really a depressing story because, he actually gave up the opportunity to play Frankenstein. The reason being that he felt like, he didn't want to be the monster that just sort of walked around and made grunting noises, and had no idea that it was going to make Boris Karloff the incredible star and celebrity that he became. So, unfortunately, Lugosi's career declined pretty rapidly after that. As far as sort of the idea of drugs and monsters, I am very interested in the way that the vampire mythology has focused more and more over the last 20 years in the notion of addiction, particularly with some of these brooding vampires these brooding, tormented vampires that we have in pop culture, who almost sort of can't seem to help themselves and are always sort of trying to struggle, with their addiction to human blood. And then, that's coming very clearly from, public cultural discourses about addictive behavior.
Yeah, but I think there's another category there that we are hinting at, which is that for a while it was the crystal meth. It was like babysitters on PCP during that whole period where all these urban legends about that. Right. But then even, going back to Reefer Madness, and even before that, back to the Victorian era about, drinking a potion and becoming a completely different person in the Jekyll Hyde scenario. Right.
And, it's interesting that you mentioned Reefer Madness, because, there's often been a tendency in American culture to connect sort of, poisonous, deadly drugs to the foreign. And to the exotic. I mean, some of the first anti-marijuana laws in the Southwest were really sort of anti-immigrant laws, sort of directed against this sort of fear of Hispanic immigrants, and drugs coming from Mexico. I think it's always been a part of sort of our ideas about the other, the dangerous other.
Well, I think there's also a tie-in with zombies on drugs in America and the rise in popularity in zombies. I think that also intersects there. But we have a half hour left, and we're going to make the most of it. Thank you, Scott Poole, for taking all of our questions about monsters in America. Ryan wants to talk about his favorite monster, and you can too, just to chat about what it means to us. What do the monsters represent? How are we informed by our monsters? Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. Wandering around in the Twilight Zone. That's what we've done all night long. Monsters in America. It's a band called Screaming Blue Messiahs, and I Want to Be a Flintstone I guess it's from the 80s, right? Like late 80s. Cracks me up. Anyway, I haven't heard it forever. But the phones are packed, so we'll get to your questions, your comments about monsters in America, including your favorite monster and what you think it means to you. Also, if you missed it in the first hour, I was talking about a story we put up at coasttocoastam.com. There's an interesting werewolf story there, which I want to address with Scott Poole before it's over. And then also a story about two dogs that escaped from their home and went to a pet food store a mile away. Went on a big adventure and it ended up, they knew right where they were going to go. And they let themselves into a pet food store. There's a story done by a friend of mine named Joe Mason, who's also a big coastie. So we posted that story up at coasttocoastam.com. You ought to take a look at it. It's a lot of fun. Back to your questions and comments as we wrap up this conversation about monsters amongst us next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Dr. Scott Poole, Roger Wheat tweeted, my favorite American monster is the Jersey Devil. I'm hearing that from a lot of people.
Yeah.
But that's a uniquely American monster.
It absolutely is, and is actually a very old monster. It goes back to an oral tradition in the 1720s and 1730s. So it's been around a long time. Very misogynistic monster story, too. Most of the origin stories of the Jersey Devil have it that is born out of a witch or born out of a woman who was unfaithful to her husband or born from a woman who refused to have more children. Yep. So kind of intertwined with some of the misogyny of the witch hunt era.
And now it's intertwined with Snooki.
Absolutely, yeah. I've just made a joke about that. I said something about the Jersey Devil in class the other day, and obviously somebody said, you mean Snooki?
Yeah, there you go. Andrew is in Santa Rosa, California on Coast to Coast for Scott Poole, Monsters in America. Andrew? Andrew, are you there? Did we lose Andrew? Oh, well, sorry about that. We'll move on, and we'll go to Scott, who's in Columbus, Ohio, Monsters in America. Oh, no, that's Dale. Dale, go ahead.
Hi, Ian. It's great to talk to you.
And you're talking with Scott Poole. Go ahead.
Thank you, Scott, for all your information, and it's great to be able to hear from you.
Thanks.
I have two stories, if you have time.
Well, we have time for one anyway, because we've got so many other people that want to get on.
Okay, the first one is 6 years ago. My family and I went down to Hocking Hills in Ohio. It's a very rural place in Ohio. And we went down there to ride horseback. We were staying down there for the weekend. We thought we'd take the kids out and have a good time. So we were down there for the weekend, and we were on the horseback. And we were riding through this field, and there was this creature. It was a brown-haired creature that was off to the right-hand side of the trail. And the horses all reared up, all 5 of the horses reared up, and they wouldn't go any further. So everyone was backing off. The horses were actually backing up on the trail.
What did you think it was, Dale?
Well, it was the Grassman.
The Grassman?
Yeah, it was the Ohio Grassman. It was the Ohio Bigfoot. And that's exactly what we saw.
How close were you then?
No more than 30 yards away.
How big did it appear to you?
It was crouched down when we first saw it. Then it stood up, and it ran kind of catty-corner from the horses. The horses took off. I mean, they backed way up the trail.
Sure. Well, that's very interesting. And Scott, I don't think I read about the Grassman in Monsters in America.
I don't think I came across the Grassman either, although, it has always interested me about the Bigfoot story that it just sort of how quickly it became trans-regional. So much so that essentially, every region has its Bigfoot now, and I believe there's been discussions about, maybe they're migrating and that kind of thing, but but it certainly was a monster that captured the public consciousness in a really powerful way. I don't think we actually give enough attention to the kind of media storm that those first sightings in Oregon really set off.
But I think that, I've talked to people who study the skunk ape out of Florida.
In Florida, yeah.
And I think they would make an argument that it may not be the same as Sasquatch, and that because of the Everglades, because of the different environment, that it might be a different type of species that just haven't been able to get any closer than that. I mean, I don't know that they're all the same. I see the similarities, but let me grab Kinzer, who is in Charleston. Can't be too far away from where you teach. Scott Poole, first-time caller line. Go ahead.
Yeah. I've been watching horror movies since I was really little, like probably a little too young to be watching horror movies.
Yeah, me
right.
I've always liked Michael Myers and Jason.
Yeah.
And not too long ago, I read this article that said the reason that people are attracted to those types of horror movies with masks and stuff is that in kind of a sick, masochistic way, it lets you project your own personal devil or fear.
Yeah.
Onto the mask and
onto the white mask,
the painted William Shatner mask. Yeah.
Right.
I don't buy that at all. That's an old interpretation of the slasher genre that, in fact, it's often goes along with the idea that male viewers in particular are kind of acting out their violent fantasies. I mean, some have even go so far as to say this is kind of a counter-revolution against feminism, that these films start to show up in the late 70s, early 80s, and it's sort of men, working out their rage by having these fantasies about killing women. I think that really misreads both sort of the director's intent with these movies. A lot of these directors, like John Carpenter and Halloween, tended to be very progressive, very liberal figures. It also kind of ignores the really important role that women play in these movies. I mean, they're not just victims. In fact, these are some of the films in which you really see the beginnings of the creation of the female action hero. I mean, Laurie Strode in Halloween, this kind of final girl character that is really the one that fights the monster and often kills the monster, at least until the sequel.
I don't know if you know this. You probably do because you're an expert on monsters in America. But I know you mentioned Todd Browning and the director of Dracula and Freaks.
Right. And a Freaks,
Did you know who his uncle was? Todd Browning.
I don't.
His uncle was the Louisville Slugger, after whom the bat is named. Isn't that cool? Yeah, especially because of the whole bat and Dracula thing that here we have. But his uncle was a professional baseball player in Louisville, and that was his nickname, was the Louisville Slugger, and they started making the bat there, and they gave it that nickname. Even though he was a total mess, he was apparently also famous for rounding the bases and falling asleep because he was drunk while he was rounding the bases. Let's go to Adam in Peoria on Coast to Coast for Scott Poole, Monsters in America. Adam?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the current zombie craze.
Yeah.
I think as far as what it means and why it's been out recently, I think a lot of people are kind of missing the forest for the trees on this one. I think the zombie genre has never been more on the nose than it is right now.
Mm-hmm. Because?
There's a whole generation of people right now dealing with elderly family members that, the body is still there, but the mind is not.
Oh, kind of an Alzheimer's tie-in.
Yeah, exactly, to the point where not too long ago, I believe Pat Robertson or someone like him came out and said that he felt it was morally justified to divorce a spouse with Alzheimer's because they weren't them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's an interesting comment. I hadn't thought about Alzheimer's.
It really is, and in fact, some of the literary zombie genre, which is sort of a new thing. Colson Whitehead, in fact,
right,
really important literary writer. Just recently wrote a zombie novel, and many of these kinds of novels use zombies to think about our relationship with the dead. In fact. And sort of the parts of our own lives that we are in mourning over. So that the zombie becomes kind of this symbol of people that we have lost, people that are literally disconnected in a way.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that it's worth exploring that. I mean, I think the fact of the matter is that zombies are so popular because they yield so easily to so many
that's good.
metaphorical interpretations, and they all work in different kinds of ways.
Ryan's talking about Monsters in America in regard to, which one's your favorite, Ryan?
Yeah, hi, guys. I'll keep this quick. It was actually Herman Munster on the Munsters. I can't remember. Was it Fred Gwynn who played that? Actually, yeah. But I was actually going to ask you real quick. I'll keep this quick for other people to call in. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and when it comes to zombies, my dad always said I'm kind of like a zombie because I take insulin, but if I don't take insulin, I would die. But I'm still alive, but technically I should be dead. I know it's kind of an odd...
Oh, no, you know what? That's a really interesting stretch, but I could see that in a way. It's true for anybody. I think that's true for anybody who has a terminal illness, so to speak, whose life can be, perpetuated and maintained at a high quality of life for years. I think that's a really interesting point. I don't know. I hadn't thought about that before. Had you, Scott?
No, I mean, yeah, I think that is interesting. I think it does, again, point to the idea that zombies are sort of this reflection on how we define life. I think that, we are having all sorts of ethical discussions about what that means. And, in so many of the films, this has particularly become an issue in The Walking Dead, but it goes all the way back to Romero's Dawn of the Dead. Is this whole issue of sort of the killing of the zombie. Is that okay? Does that dehumanize the humans that are left when they do that?
Right.
What happens when they start enjoying that, which... often zombie fictions look into what happens to human beings in this post-apocalyptic situation. So, it's just a really interesting field for all sorts of ethical reflections, I think.
Or should we think about killing zombies in the same way that we think about killing the bacteria on our kitchen counter? That it's life we're killing with a spray, but it preserves another form of life at the same time. Hey, Tyler, was zombies or your favorite monsters in America?
That's correct.
Okay, you had a quick thought on that?
Yeah, I've been a fan of, like the Romero stuff, the slow, shambling zombie, but there was this movie back, I think it was 2002 or 2004, I can't remember. Danny Boyle directed it. It was called 28 Days Later.
Yeah.
There were zombies in that movie that scared the living daylights out of me because, I had never personally seen it before, but I literally had this zombie who was not slow, not shambling. You had this thing that was basically at the speed of a track runner.
Right, it was an evolved zombie, so to speak.
Yeah, and they were also, they were the products of medical experimentation. They were the products of a virus. And I actually think I've actually had some horror fans call me on the fact that in Monsters in America, I say that I describe 28 Days Later as a zombie movie, and what they've said is, that's not quite right. It's actually a film about our fear of disease, which I do think, with films like Contagion, this even comes up in Rise of Planet of the Apes. That seems to be one of our new fears, one of the worst things waiting, like we were talking about earlier.
Well, but it's still a zombie movie, just in the same way it would be like saying,
dead, though.
Well, I know, but it'd be like saying The Werewolf is really a film about anti-Semitism. It's true, but it's still a werewolf movie. Right?
Well, yeah, I think the distinction they're making is that Romero's zombies are very clearly dead. They are the undead, and what you're really dealing with in 28 Days is human beings who are infected with the rage virus, as it's called.
Right. Let's go to Wayne in Frederick, Maryland on Coast to Coast. Wayne?
Morning.
Hey, you're talking with Scott Poole, Monsters in America.
Yeah, I was curious as to how he felt with the Resident Evil movies.
Yeah.
As with the zombie vampire-ish is the way of corporate America, with they
the Umbrella
do something
Corporation.
wrong, if that's more along the lines of a newer monster fear.
Yeah, I don't know if it's newer, but I think that is certainly a part of those films. One of the best expressions of this was the Bret Easton Ellis novel American Psycho, which with the whole Pierce and Pierce mergers and acquisitions. And it's really sort of this satire takedown of corporate America. There's also one of my favorite horror writers is a guy named Thomas Ligotti. And Ligotti actually has started writing more and more about sort of the horror of the workplace, the terror in the cubicle sorts of stories. So, going back to zombies, there's actually even been this argument. I read an article just the other day that sort of these flash mob zombie walks and parades.
We do there's a lot of those in the Twin Cities here.
That's sort of intertwined in certain ways with the Occupy movement. And in fact, you actually even had some Occupy protesters who dressed up like zombies, had dollar bills falling out of their mouths, and were sort of, saw themselves as satiring corporate America.
Let's go to Paul in Woodland Hills. We're running out of time. We'll try to get everybody on that we can. Hey, Paul.
How you doing, guys? I just want to say Coast to Coast kicks ass, and I want to make a real rapido. My question was to Mr. Scott Poole. How do you feel about the connection between Satanism and Mr. David Icke talks about the reptilians and, just the creatures in themselves, like you said, the Black Lagoon earlier, and, Godzilla. The same thing with Dracula. I see, a correlation with the Vatican, the Francis Ford Coppola movie. And also another one was the misinterpretation of Hollywood and, how does Hollywood, how do you think?
Okay. Well, you got a lot there to try to, you got a lot going on there, Paul. Let's try and sort that out real quickly. Go ahead.
The Satanism connection is interesting because we haven't talked about Satan yet, but, in some ways Satan has been America's premier monster. He's also been one monster that lots and lots of Americans have believed in a very literal kind of way over several centuries. And that actually is something that interests me very much, particularly what we call the satanic panic of the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, where many Americans convinced that there was sort of this vast underground conspiracy of Satan,
sure.
much like in early modern Europe. You had many people convinced that the same thing was going on with witches. So, I almost think if I had to pick a monster that has been most influential in American history, I would have to say the devil, in part because, again, it's been a theological belief
sure.
rather than simply a folk belief or a pop culture image.
What's interesting about that, though, too, is what he was hinting at there about the reptilians, and that it was sort of like the movie series V, the TV series or the miniseries, the idea of that reptilians taking human form.
Right.
And that is there's something, again, it goes back to what we think almost the perfect are the ones who are going to be the ones to mislead us. It's almost like, and I'm not saying this to make a point, but Mitt Romney is such a perfect looking human being that he'd be the last guy you would expect to pull off a skin, and have it be reptilian underneath. And I think that's part of what that tension exists somehow within us as Americans, always wondering what's really underneath the skin. So thank you so much. I hope that you had a good time. I know it was a long night. Do you have to teach in the morning?
I don't actually, yeah. So I'm not teaching tomorrow, so I'm going home and going to bed.
Well, excellent. Monsters in America, our historical obsession with the hideous and the haunting, really informative on so many levels. And thank you so much for all of your time. I look forward to revisiting the subject somewhere down the road, too. And that's it. Between now and next month, I don't have any more scheduled appearances here on Coast to Coast, but feel free to keep in touch at Deacon Punit if you're on Twitter. Love to do it that way. And great shows coming up this week, including that 15th anniversary of the Phoenix Lights with George Norrie on Tuesday, I am told. On Coast to Coast, Deus Te Amat, and I do too.